it's time for us now to have to have the government that we want and to be voted the way that we want. And actually, we're going to go to the streets and we're going to make sure that's going to happen. And I think it's going to be a very, very interesting year. We absolutely are going to light those matches, and we're going to start this change. It's going to be a big year, but ultimately, it comes down to the people. It always comes down to the people. If people want Cape independence, then at some point they're going to have to get behind it.
So the question should not be for a free-thinking person, what is a president going to say tomorrow? Because that is why that's a sign that we are not free. We hope we have a good president. We hope he gets himself to making a decision, even just one. We hope the ANC may vote in good guys and not bad guys. All those are hopes that other people make good decisions, which they tend not to do.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're going to chat about Cape independence and the Freedom Front Plus's role in it. We are joined by Phil Craig from the Cape Independence Advocacy Group, who wants to reclaim the Western Cape for Her Majesty the Queen, and Dr. Wynand Boshoff, an MP for the Freedom Front Plus. So Phil, let's start with you. Was the local election result a success for Cape Independence? Because I know Professor Peter Vos tweeted that Cape Independence Party got only 0.5% of the votes, which is a rejection of Cape Independence. But we both know that it's much more complicated than that.
Sure. So it's funny, isn't it? Because in politics, I think reality and perception are two different things, but both very powerful. So in terms of Cape independence itself, we did very well in the elections, and we pretty well came in where I expected us to be. So we were anticipating that parties who openly supported secession would get between 5 and 6% of the vote, and collectively they got 5.3% of the provincial vote. But that, of course, was split between the three parties that all had Cape independence in their manifestos, which was the Freedom Front, the Cape Coloured Congress, and the Cape Independence Party. But the Cape Independence Party probably had a slightly disappointing election, and of course that has, for anybody who wants to equate Cape independence with the Cape Independence Party in its entirety, then obviously that has led to people saying, look, hang on a second, it's been a bad election for Cape independence. And unfortunately for the independence movement, that does create a problem of perception, because I think there is a general perception that Cape independence didn't do very well, when in actual fact its support for secessionist parties grew from 0.8% to 5.3%. And then we also have to remember that there were local government elections, and we know the vast majority of independent supporters vote for the DA. And just to put that into context, we polled twice in 2020 and 2021, and in 2020 there was 36% support for Cape independence. 2021, 46% support for Cape independence, and on both occasions the Cape Independence Party didn't actually register in polling at all, because they're a small peripheral party and an important party, and an ally of ours, but they certainly aren't where the majority of Cape Independence supporters put their votes.
Does Fadil Adams still support Cape Independence? I recently saw a video which he seemed to suggest in an Al Jazeera video that Cape Independence is the same as creating a Volksstaat.
So, well, funny enough, look, I'm trying to speak to Fadil as we speak. So, actually, if you saw that interview, it was slightly conflicted. What he said was, look, we don't want to be slaves, but I think secession is a very good idea. And actually, if you go, it's in their constitution. They support Cape independence. Or Cape independence. They support a broader version. They want the Northern Cape and parts of the Eastern Cape to be included too. But I think one of the things, I like Fardil. He's obviously a sort of fairly radical politician. He is very passionate about the coloured people, and I'm fully behind him in that. I think they've got a terribly rough deal over the time, and he wants to have a fair shake of the whip, I suppose. But what I would say, and my message to Fardil, both personally when I've spoken to him and now, is look, don't be on the outside of the movement. Yeah, effectively what Fardil was saying is we want Cape independence, but we don't want your version of Cape independence. And my answer to Fardil is there is no our version or the Freedom Front's version of the Cape independence. This is something that we're all going to collectively own, and they must come on the inside and fight for their version of Cape independence with us. And ultimately, it's not going to be any one of us that decides individually what Cape independence looks like. It's going to be the collective people of the Western Cape democratically deciding that. So, but they do support secession, yes, but clearly what they don't want is to see white privilege preserved and for Cape independence to be an excuse for that, and nor do we, and nor do the Freedom Front Plus, I'm sure. So on that, I would completely agree with him. But I would prefer to have a closer working relationship.
Yeah, it seems like a logistical nightmare to keep all these movements together in favor of Cape independence. But Wynand, is one of the reasons why the Freedom Front Plus did so well in the Western Cape independence.
I think it's certainly one of the reasons. The whole South African dispensation is a federation with a unitary nature, or the other way around, just the way you want to see it, because there are federal characteristics in the constitution, but that has not came into reality because we have a centralized governing party wanting to, keep everything under the central government's control. And that seemed all nice and acceptable as long as there was an idea that maybe the central government knows what it does. The more that unravels, the more federal kind of thinking will gain ground. And that is what had happened in the 2021 elections, even before that in the 2019 elections, that parties with a local emphasis and with an emphasis on community rights did better than before. We have with the ANC and with the DA and the EFF, the three major parties, the three parties getting more than 10%. They have a very strong national perspective, and they take the unitary state of South Africa as a given, and then they work from that. The Freedom Front, together with other parties, have another view of what South Africa should look like. It's always funny to think that South Africa is just a little bit more than 110 years old. I mean, we view it as if it has been called into being with the creation. And on the 8th day, the Lord said, there shall be South Africa. And we seem not to be able to think ourselves out of this colonial South Africa. If I say we, I mean the broad South African population. Now, I think it's an advantage if you have a multitude of parties and organizations all advocating for this idea of Cape independence, having different views on it, what it should look like, how it should come about, because then it becomes what Phil called our shared independence, and not somebody's, not the Freedom Fronts or not whoever's. Now, I think I like to start the discussion with referring to an independent Cape, and then I like to let that evolve into a federal Cape, because very easily one can see an independent Cape as just a mirror image or a smaller model of the present South Africa. So we have a centralized South Africa, and then we will just have half that size, a centralized Cape. But if we approach that in a very fundamental federal way, to say, doesn't even need to be symmetrical. In the Cape Metropole, we have a strong independent city. Of course, not sovereign independency like, say, the Vatican or something like that, but the Cape Town has a nature of its own, which is distinctly different from the Boland or the Klein Karoo or the Makwaland or other areas. We are also part of the Cape thinkers. We think that the Northern Cape, or the largest part of the Northern Cape, should constitute a part of an independent Cape. But that will all depend on the question whether there will be support for that. We can sit around saying this should be included, that should be excluded. It's to be decided by the people in the different areas. I think the problems in South Africa, or the problem with South Africa, hasn't reached such a stage that independence is the first thing in people's minds. And that's why a single issue party like the Cape Independence Party got limited support. Even the Freedom Front got limited support because the Freedom Front is viewed as a little bit of a single issue party. While, let's say, a lot of their voters have a single issue, and that is to beat the ANC. Well, let's take it from there. I don't want to keep on rambling on.
I mean, this might be a bit off topic, but did you recently challenge Dr. Groenewald in a leadership election? Because it seems like only RSG picked it up.
Rapport also did.
Oh.
Let's say it was more like a message to the inside rather than a message to the outside. So I wouldn't like to discuss it in too much detail, but that happened.
Phil, it's also true that I think with your help that a lot of people supported the DA because of their pledge to support a referendum. So there's also support for Cape independence amongst DA voters.
Well, look, we know from... Go on, sorry?
Sorry, Phil, go on, sorry.
No, fine. No, look, we know from our polling that the majority of DA supporters support Cape independence, and I think what we've seen is, and I think actually something Wynand, I enjoyed listening to you there, Wynand, because I agree with a lot of the things you said, and I think what we've seen is exactly that in the elections, that the sort of the centralizers against the devolvers. This is the big divide that's starting to happen, and it's one of the interesting things when you start to look at Cape politics. We have to realise just how far the DA, for argument's sake, has come in the last couple of years towards devolution. So they're not standing at this point in time for Cape independence, but they're standing for internal self-determination. They don't use the word self-determination. They probably think that's one of the Freedom Front's words. But I mean, when you start saying, listen, we must be able to get the government we vote for. We must be able to have powers to make decisions for ourselves. We must be able to run our own police service. We must be able to run our own transport service. At one point, must be able to even collect their own taxes. Then you're talking about self-determination. You might not be talking about cultural self-determination. You're talking about territorial self-determination. But actually, so at this point in time, you've got a DA that is firmly supporting self-determination, internal self-determination. The only difference is we're supporting external self-determination, and actually, so it's quite logical that we kind of think of these things as in very clear, crisp boxes, but they're not. It's a movement. We're all sick and tired of this central government that's dominating the country, which in the Western Cape we haven't voted for, we didn't elect, we don't support. Its conduct is totally appalling, and actually at this point in time, yes, we've got differences about how that solution is, but fundamentally you've got this big mass of people that are wanting to take control of their own lives, and from our point of view as an organisation, we try to work closely with all of the political parties, and that certainly includes the DA, because they're a critical part of the solution, and for us that's very much how we see the future of this movement. There's going to be a movement further and further and further towards autonomy and devolution, which ultimately will result in Cape independence. And I think you have this, what we're pushing for is something called remedial secession. And remedial secession is when countries are denied internal self-determination, and people often struggle to make this connection between the two concepts. You've got the DA pushing for internal self-determination, and actually you've got us pushing for external self-determination on the basis that we haven't got internal self-determination. Now, logically speaking, with 55% of the vote, the DA is going to get the first crack at the whip. They're going to push for their version of autonomy, but actually the ANC have shown no willingness to concede on internal self-determination. So all they're doing at this point in time is driving DA voters and the DA itself further and further towards external self-determination, because once internal self-determination is taken off the table, that's the only thing that's going to be left.
Wynand, you wanted to add something?
No, I think it's exactly true. The way to preserve national unity is to grant internal self-determination. I don't really expect the ANC to take any advice from me, but if I had their ideology in mind and I would advise them, it would be to grant internal self-determination. Because if you can have what you want without seceding, then the urge to secede subsides. It's interesting that with the civil war in Ethiopia, which went on from the 1960s until Eritrea seceded in 1990 somewhere, then the new Ethiopian constitution explicitly said if any of the territories want to secede, this is the way to do it. And that created quite an extent of stability in Ethiopia. But in the meantime, another generation has passed, and the central government of Ethiopia started to like the whole central kind of thing, centralizing kind of thing again. So now we have another civil war going on there. But the idea that you have to subject different cultural groups or territories, areas who have some interest or some identity which urge them to have a kind of autonomy, but you deny that, then you drive it towards secession. And I believe that's what the ANC is doing at the moment. It's exactly playing into the hands of the opposite of what they are ideologically. One South Africa, one undivided, non-racist, non-sexist. Like the one guy of the ANC when we were students accidentally said non-sexual South Africa. That is, they work towards the opposite. What they are doing at the moment. And I wonder whether this past election of 2021 won't make a big difference on how the ANC thinks about it, because if they want to govern the economic heartland of South Africa, which is Gauteng, actually you could say the rest of South Africa is a colony of Gauteng, or colonies of Gauteng. If they want to keep on governing that, now they need some way to overflow the opposition votes in Gauteng, going to either the DA or Action SA or whoever. So Mpumalanga and Limpopo and Northwest could maybe do that if they could cut off the Cape part where they have a minority of the votes. So suddenly practical concerns may become a little bit more important than this ideological resoluteness to keep South Africa as a whole. The problem for us as a Freedom Front is that the majority of our voters are actually in the northern provinces. And there needs to be a way in which an independent Cape is also to the advantage of those voters. Otherwise, the DA said that explicitly. No, we are not for an independent Cape because we want to support our supporters in the northern provinces too. Now, of course, the same is true for the Freedom Front. Full referred to cultural and territorial self-determination as two different forms of this animal called self-determination. But for Afrikaners in the rest of South Africa, it will be to a huge advantage if there is a place where Afrikaans is still the dominant language and where things can be created by medium of Afrikaans. And that could be to the advantage of Afrikaans speakers wherever they are. The kind of thing of German schools all over the world being subsidized by Germany, whatever. There are many different ways in which people with the same broad cultural background than in the Cape can link to an independent Cape. I think in Europe there are lots of examples of exactly that, the German population in Belgium and so on. The first thing is that we have to get over this hurdle of South Africa cannot be divided. The first thing people hear when they think of the division of South Africa is apartheid. Okay, so we are going with afsonderlike ontwikkeling, separate development, and you want to give everyone a homeland, and that has been thoroughly discredited internationally and internally in South Africa. But I believe that politics work in such a way that every generation has a dispensation of its own. There has to be a new dispensation being created by every generation. So if we take the South African history, we started 1902 when the British overwhelmed everyone. Then in 1924, Afrikaner, nationalists, and white English labor came together and the new dispensation was created. In 1948, again, a new dispensation, a new generation, a new dispensation. 1976, the same thing. Although the dispensation of 1976 was a low-intensity civil war going on until a new dispensation in 1994 was reached. Now we are 30 years on, nearly. A new dispensation has to be reached once again. And I think the previous one, like several other previous dispensations, proved that they did not fulfill the expectations of all the different groups. This dispensation has proven that too. So that's why we need a new dispensation, but we need leverage. We need power. Otherwise, a new dispensation will be worse than the previous one, not better.
Phil, Wynand raises a very good point where he says that, well, the DA likes to say that there's not as much support outside of the Western Cape for Cape independence. But I know you want to do a poll on this, and we have a suspicion that there might be as much or even more support outside of the Western Cape for Cape independence, because then those people can come here. I mean, there's a legitimate excuse to leave everything and come to the Western Cape. So what do you think of that?
No, so look, yeah. So I think people just first of all have to understand what's the main driving force behind Cape independence, and it's not about the physical territory; it's about the ideology. And the reason we start with the Western Cape in the first instance, although likewise we're quite flexible and would expect those borders probably to expand along democratic lines and at municipal levels, depending on how people wanted to be governed. It's this ideological difference, and you've got we've got 30 years of election results. We know it's a matter of empirical fact that the people in the Western Cape have a different ideology to the people in the rest of South Africa. I've previously, in the same way as we know that the north of Africa has a different way of thinking to sub-Saharan Africa. I've sometimes referred to the Western Cape as sub-Saharan Africa. It's an entity on its own that has a distinct ideology apart from South Africa, and that's what Cape independence is about. It's about recognizing that on one side of the border, the majority of people have one prevailing ideology, and on the other side of the border, we have completely different ideology. We've got different values. We want to be governed different ways, and we can see it. And we don't have to look at that along race or culture. We can just go and look and see what happened in election after election after election. It's a matter of fact. It's not a matter of the. And therefore, what's in it for the rest of South Africa is people who are living in the rest of South Africa who are an ideological minority and are at risk of being completely drowned out ideologically by this dominant prevailing ideology, now have an ally where they're so what the I don't like the word homeland, but what the Western Cape will become is it will become the ideological homeland for people in the rest of South Africa who may not move to the Western Cape, but actually their ideology will now have a homeland, a base, a base of operations and an ally in South Africa. It may well be that somebody continues their business operations or into South Africa. We're all going to have people on both sides of the border, but we have this now ideological territory that preserves that let's call it a market orientated non-racial ideology in the Western Cape and whatever territory that subsequently becomes. So therefore I think there's a huge benefit, because it allows, and all of a sudden people who may still be in South Africa now have this ally, this absolute ally of people who have their ideology, who are not right next door, who ultimately are next door, are a country who have the ability to maintain and project power, and in an absolute worst case scenario, it's a place of refuge for if South Africa collapses. So I think there's everything to gain for the rest of South Africa. And actually, as an organisation, we found that some of our most fervent and strongest supporters, and certainly most of our donors, come from outside of the Western Cape, because I think in the Western Cape, the majority of citizens still have blinkers on. They still don't realise how bad it is in the rest of the country, because it's not quite that bad here yet. Whereas people living outside of the Western Cape have seen exactly what the future is going to look like. And and I've always think this bizarre. For me, it's always been bizarre to think, hey, look, you know what? If the ANC can be brought under 50%, salvation is near. I would much rather have the ANC had 51% of the vote than 49, because at 49 they're far, far more dangerous than they are at 51.
What is the Cape Independence Advocacy Group trying to achieve with this lobbying for an end to BEE and the Western Cape?
Well, so what are we trying to achieve? What we're trying to achieve is we're trying to emphasise the difference in ideology, and actually we're trying to emphasize to people that, hang on a second, to show them in some mechanism what is different about the Western Cape and the rest of South Africa. So it's quite important, and it's an issue that will be an international issue, and it's an issue where the moral high ground will be seen. So you have to break that down. The South African Constitution, 1B, the founding principle of the South African Constitution is non-racialism, and then that is manifested in the Bill of Rights, which goes on to say that discrimination on the basis of race, sex, religion, blah blah blah, but race is expressly prohibited and is automatically unfair. But there's a caveat, and the caveat says unless it's deemed to be fair. So what you end up is actually race-based legislation in South Africa is a caveat, it's an exclusion, and it's because the national government, with its transformational agenda, and I've got nothing against with genuine transformation, but we haven't got genuine transformation. So this transformational agenda, which actually spills over into the courts, you have now basically said, racialism is fair. It's fair because of the past. And actually, I can get that there are moral arguments both ways. But the reality is the moral arguments fall to one side because the policies have been an absolute disaster. And actually, inequality is increased, poverty has got worse, unemployment's through the roof. So the policies fundamentally are failing anyway. So you haven't even got to get to the moral arguments. So now you end up turning that round and you come back to the Western Cape and say, well, look, okay, so in the Western Cape, we've now got a group of people. We've got a constitution that says that non-racialism is the founding provision, and racial discrimination is unfair. And in that territory, you've got a government that's been elected who supports non-racialism, is opposed to racialism. You've got the majority of the people are opposed to racial discrimination, and actually you've got a territory where the majority of the people are are minorities, ethnic minorities. So now you've got this scenario where the government doesn't want it, the people doesn't want it, and the majority of the people in the province are discriminated against by it. And actually that turns around and said, well, how can that possibly be fair? It can't be fair. And if the rest of South Africa wants to have those policies, then the Western Cape, then at least there's an argument there that says, well, hang on a second, the majority in theory are benefiting and the majority support it. But the Western Cape don't. So therefore, the rest of South Africa is having a affirmative action EE as an exemption from the Constitution. And what we're calling for is for the Western Cape to be exempted from the exemption. In other words, the Constitution to apply as it was originally originally written based on the fact that the majority of people want it and that the elected government wants it. And what do we see the big win in that? We see the ANC on the world stage having to justify why it is forcing apartheid-era racial classifications and racism onto a territory against the democratic will of the people living there. And actually, that will be absolutely untenable for the ANC. It'll be hugely embarrassing, and it will show people the difference between a non-racial Western Cape and an African nationalist South Africa, and it'll be laid bare, and we see it as a really decisive issue that is going to really put the ANC in a very, very difficult position on the international and the domestic stage.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. I've always struggled to understand why you have to put the words non-racialism and non-sexism in a document. It should be self-evident. I mean, it's like going to a party and introducing yourself as, I'm Donald Brown, I'm not a sexist, I'm not a racist. I mean, what? Yeah, it's strange to me. But Wynand, I recently spoke to R.V. Johnson, and he recently wrote an article on the Freedom Front Plus, where he said that the Freedom Front Plus struggles to gain English-speaking South Africans because it's sort of seen like a rump of the National Party or the Conservative Party melded into one. Is there a plan of the Freedom Front Plus to gain white support, English-speaking white supporters?
That is part of the whole question in South Africa. Whom are you representing? Now, the 1994 reality or the pre-1994 reality was a racially driven one, not a cultural driven one. So whites had the franchise and blacks did not have. And that became fundamentally problematic. So then we said, okay, we don't have rights in Africa as a race group, but as a cultural group who associate with Africa and South Africa. Now, that does not exclude English-speaking whites, because I think, especially in the past 30 years, we have seen with immigration that at least the same percentage of Afrikaners tend to immigrate somewhere to the English world than English-speaking South Africans or white South Africans. But the thing is that to identify and define yourself in terms of a race group is something that we decided not to do. Therefore, the Freedom Front was founded as an Afrikaner party, and also because Afrikaners were the only group who, in sizable numbers, were skeptical about this whole new dispensation, saying that maybe we need something like self-determination. The Conservative Party, before the Freedom Front, tried its very best to attract English speakers, speaking votes. Some of Dr. Treenicht's speeches were half in English, half in Afrikaans. I don't think it really ever succeeded. I think, you could count the English-speaking Conservative Party voters on your two hands, and maybe you would need the toes of one foot. But since then, and in the way that South Africa played out, we realized that we need to represent the interests of different minority groups. And that leads firstly to Afrikaans-speaking colored people or brown people, bruin mense, says better in Afrikaans than in English. And then, of course, also English South Africans, and it's interesting that many Portuguese voters turned towards the Freedom Front. We even have a Jewish branch in Johannesburg where minorities say, but they need a vehicle, a political vehicle to look after their interests. So it's a long way to say that we don't try to represent whites as a race group and saying, therefore, also English-speaking. We are representing minorities. But I think in a province like the Western Cape, you have a reality where the people who should be advantaged by transformation or black economic empowerment are not present as a majority. So that makes it illogical to maintain those policies in the Western Cape. And then you get the kind of logic which Zwanele Manyi exhibited when he said there's an over-concentration of colours in the Western Cape. And then there's an under-concentration of colours in Limpopo. So what should we do? Fill all the buses with colours in the Cape and taking them to Limpopo, and then taking Bendas and Pedis from Limpopo, bringing them to the Western Cape. I mean, it's silly. Therefore, we say that the core of our support is still from Afrikaans voters. It is the case. We are reaching out to other minorities, and it all depends on whether we are perceived to be sincere, whether that outreach is going to be taken up. I don't think see a specific, kind of a commandment that you first become legitimate once you also have English support. But let's say it like this: we as Afrikaners have a nasty way of looking very hostile towards other people. We have or not hostile, but at least not. Now I'm looking for the word gasvrij. What's that in English?
Hospitable.
Hospitable. We are not perceived as a very hospitable nation, and that's a problem. That's why we actually tend to drive people away from us rather than endearing them to us. So, I think as a matter of fact, R.W. Johnson is exactly correct. We haven't attracted a large number of English-speaking votes. I think the issues that we drive might change that. It has changed in certain areas. But the main thing is not throwing out the net wider and trying to be everything for everyone. We say that the core of our belief system is that South Africa's constitutional dispensation needs to reflect the variety which the country itself embodies, and that is not the case with the present dispensation.
Yeah, I mean, it makes perfect sense, Phil, to have this sort of idea that the Cape will be the heartland for people who want a decentralized model. But it seems really like the real support lies with Afrikaans people, not really with English-speaking South Africans. I just think English-speaking South Africans are more global orientated, and Afrikaans-speaking South Africans like the idea, like Wynand said, like a cultural homeland. So, I mean, there's sort of a disconnect between what is sort of envisioned by an independent Western Cape and what the voters want.
Yeah, look. Our poll. We've never polled a long language. Perhaps we have actually. I've never checked it. But we certainly have an awful lot of support from across community. So I don't think that's. I think I think probably English voters have. I think my experience, anecdotally, is that English voters are increasingly willing to consider the Freedom Front as a possibility, and I think because they're looking for more radical solutions, and I think probably the DA's weakness is it's probably seen to be playing everything a little bit too safe and playing within the rules when then that's not where we are, and we're in extra time and we need to throw everything at it. And I think probably there's a criticism of the DA that they've probably played everything too safe. But certainly our support comes. I've certainly not noticed a particular a bias towards Afrikaners as opposed to English speakers in support for Cape independence. I think probably in terms of very liberal communities, clearly in terms of there are certain let's use woke. Clearly is see independence as fundamentally a rejection of their they would see it as racist, which is far from the truth. But I think in terms of across different cultural grounds, we get strong support across the board, and there isn't really a specific bias towards Afrikaners or English.
Yeah, it's just mere
I would
speaking.
like to add something to that,
Go ahead.
Donald, if you would allow me. Sorry. I think Phil made a very legitimate distinction just now between sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa. North Africa, which is presently, had not always been, but an Islam area. And that the one country which has that line right through it had been Sudan. And therefore, South Sudan had seceded from Sudan itself because South Sudan is sub-Saharan and Sudan is part of North Africa. And the idea that we have a line which you could say the western part of that line is about the N1 and the northern side is about the Orange River. Or not exactly, just for an indication. It's more the west of South Africa than the south of South Africa. But that area is by its nature more Western. And some Western values include classical liberal values, which has increased its support amongst Afrikaners since 1994. The interesting thing with liberal values, the whole idea of a level play field, is the stronger you feel, the more level you want the play field. The less strong you feel, then you like some tilt in your favor. And Afrikaners used to tilt the playing field towards our own favor for quite a while. After, let's say, a few decades of that, when we got to 1994, we said, no, but now we just want a level play field because we got nice and strong in the meantime. So that is what Phil referred to as the moral argument for transformation and for black economic empowerment, but that's a little bit besides this argument. What I would like to say is Afrikaners and English are just two different expressions of the Western civilization within South Africa. And that is not to give a racial slant to the whole thing. It is just a cultural thing. And to my mind, there's no, direct link to the level of pigment in your skin and the way in which you could be Western. I mean, that is absurd. But yeah, I think it's just the fact that in the western part of South Africa, the Western civilization took deeper root. It is much more ingrained in the whole being of people, whether brown, white, or black, than in the eastern parts. In the eastern parts, it is as if the Western civilization is something of an add-on. It's not the whole being. It's an add-on to being, if that seems clear.
No, I definitely agree with everything. I just think a lot of people consider themselves as English-speaking South Africans, almost specifically English-speaking white South Africans, and vice versa with Afrikaans. And if you don't sort of appeal to them specifically, that's one of the problems with South Africa. There's so many different culture groups. That's one of the reasons why the opposition is struggling so much. It's more of a indication that South Africa shouldn't really be a country. But Phil, what's some future plans for the Cape Independence Advocacy Group that you would perhaps like to talk about?
Well, look, I think this is quite a big year for us. I think this is probably a year where the back of Cape Independence needs to get broken. The referendum legislation is going to be before Parliament this year. So we hopefully we are then looking towards a referendum the year after, and clearly we need to keep the pressure on to ensure that referendum. The DA are as keen as we are for a referendum. They're probably less keen on a question on Cape independence, but are willing to hold one. But we've got to keep the pressure on to make sure that happens. So we've got to keep ourselves in the mind's eye, and we also need to move forward. I think people really the biggest issue with Cape independence right now is I think people think it's a great idea. but they don't really believe it's possible, and that's the sort of, somehow you've got to start to bridge these gaps, and yeah, sometimes, so for us, really, these next 12 months are devoted to trying to start building those gaps and starting to show people that let's say radical change is possible, and once they see radical change is possible, they'll start believing Cape independence is possible too. So fundamentally, we're working on 3 projects at the moment. We're going to hold another Independence March. Well, it'll be actually, it's going to be called a Free the Cape March on the 27th of April, Freedom Day, in Cape Town. So we want to make sure that we show people that that independence is alive and kicking, and what they say, reports of its death are much exaggerated. Then we've got this race-based legislation project that we're pushing really hard, because we see that as being actually, we see it as a gateway for other powers. We see, we don't think you're really going to get international support for who controls the police in Cape Town or who owns the railways, but we think race-based legislation has the potential to be a huge issue internationally, so we're going to push that for all we're worth. And then we're busy, and I think I can say this without going into too much detail. We're busy with a big alliance project with all of the. So we understand that fundamentally in the Western Cape, we talked about this divide between the devolutionists and the centralists, and actually we've reached across the divide, and we're busy coordinating an alliance of parties who believe in autonomy for the Western Cape, and we are going to set aside our differences in terms of what form of autonomy that must take. It doesn't really matter if somebody wants federalism, or they want just more power, or they want independence, because the referendum can sort that out when it comes. But actually, we need to collaborate and find ways of taking power away from Pretoria and delivering it to the people of the Western Cape. And once people start to see, once they start to see powers being taken away from Pretoria, or alternatively Pretoria digging its heels and refusing powers to be taken away, is just as powerful for us, and we're going to be the heart of that. And one of the things that we push quite hard with political parties is to and I have to say that the Freedom Front have always been good at understanding it, is that just in Parliament and in the courts are not the only weapons that you've got. And actually, what we really want to find in this alliance is the alliance between political parties, between civic organisations, between academia, and between people on the streets, and that we collectively use all of those forces together to start delivering change. And that will start off being the devolution of the police, the control of the police, race-based legislation, and hopefully exemption for race-based legislation, and so on and so forth. Because if we can really now start demanding things as the Western Cape, and demanding as the provincial government, as all of the parties that support that, as civic organisations, as people on the streets, and through the courts, then all of a sudden we can have this really powerful political force. And we have to remember that in the Western Cape, those forces account for about 65% of all voters. That is the dominant political power. So, and people sometimes say to us, "Oh, look, are you going soft on Cape independence?" We absolutely are not. For us, Cape independence is the only final solution. It's the only way that's going to work. If we can't control our own economy, then everything else is lost. But we don't want to we don't want to take our 5% and stand in the corner and shout at the other 95% and pick fights where we force the ANC and the DA to stand together. We want to get the 65% of people in the Western Cape who fundamentally, well, political voters, actually in terms of polling, 75% of Western Cape voters want to see devolved power. And actually what we want to start off doing is getting power devolved from Pretoria to the Western Cape, and start the process of Cape independence actually on the ground bit by bit. So when the referendum comes in 18 months' time, people start to believe it's possible, because that's the key. We need that tipping point for people to believe this is really possible, so they get off their bums and get onto the streets and start demanding the change they want. Because when we get, I think we've referred to it before, there was this fantastic BBC report. They analysed world politics for about 50 years. And they said, statistically, they did a lot of research, and statistically, they said that non-violent protests were twice as successful as violent protests. And they said there'd never been a situation where 3.5% of the population got actively involved in a cause that it wasn't successful. So they say 3.5%. And that for us, we need to get 3.5% of the Cape population really, really motivated onto the streets, saying we've had enough. And actually, we're not going to sit around to 2024 and hope that perhaps we can get the ANC to 48% and then cobble together some half-assed coalition that's going to fall at the first hurdle because we had to have Julius voters in, when actually we're sitting here with 65% of the vote. We want to be governed the way that we vote. And actually, we don't need anybody's permission. Let's get out on the streets, let's take it, and let's be the change, and then allow the constitutional processes to catch up. And I'm not talking about doing anything illegal here, but what I'm saying is creating the political reality on the ground that says we don't want to be governed by a corrupt, incompetent government that we didn't vote for. We want to be voted. We want to be governed by the people that we voted for and in the manner that we want to be voted, and we have that right. That is the basis of self-determination. We don't want an ANC government. We don't want corrupt ministers being recycled. We don't want race-based legislation. We don't want any of those things. We want to get on. We were promised a country in 1994 that actually was going to be a fresh start for everybody, and that absolutely isn't what we've got, and we need to get back to that and to create something in the Western Cape where and bearing in mind that we've been voting for it for 30 years, we just never got it. So it's time for us now to have to have the government that we want and to be voted the way that we want. And actually, we're going to go to the streets and we're going to make sure that's going to happen. And I think it's going to be a very, very interesting year. We absolutely are going to light those matches, and we're going to start this change. It's going to be a big year, but ultimately, it comes down to the people. It always comes down to the people. If people want Cape independence, then at some point they're going to have to get behind it.
Sounds exciting. But yeah, gentlemen, I see our time is running out. Last words, last question I want to ask you. Today is the 9th of February. Tomorrow is the State of the Nation. It's the State of the Nation, not the State of the Union. And it's going to happen unless they burn down the Cape City Council building as well. So what are your predictions? Because I think everything is going to change. I think Ramaphosa is going to reduce the cabinet to 15 ministers. He's going to privatize all state-owned institutions. He's going to decentralize the entire South Africa. That's all going to happen tomorrow. And I might be wrong. There's a chance I might be wrong. But what are your predictions, Wynand?
Yeah, that would be nice. I wouldn't quite bet my life on your prediction. No, what I would like to say is the question is not whether the Cape can be free. The question is whether South African can keep its act together, and it can't. Yeah. It should be clear to any observer that South African can't remain together. And once you've realized that, then you can start saying, okay, so how are we going to give direction to the disentanglement of this geographical concoction, which is called South Africa? And then one would say, I don't want to take the responsibility for how people in KwaZulu-Natal approached this, or people in the Eastern Cape, or people in the Northern provinces, all of them. But we know that in the Cape we have a cultural, geographical coherence going from the Orange River, or well, I would rather say from the Red River, but very few people really know where the Red River is. Southwards, the three western district municipalities of the Northern Cape, the Bokaroo, the Benede Oranje, Lower Orange, and Namakwa, together with the Western Cape, is a cultural and geographical coherent unit. And that should take up its freedom. It should take up its lot in its own hands, its destiny in its own hands. So when are you free? It is when you can make good decisions or bad decisions and then take the results for that. So the question should not be for a free-thinking person, what is a president going to say tomorrow? because that is why that's a sign that we are not free. We hope we have a good president. We hope he gets himself to making a decision, even just one. We hope the ANC may vote in good guys and not bad guys. All those are hopes that other people make good decisions, which they tend not to do. And we should say, okay, we are listening tomorrow to the State of the Nation in order to know how to direct our own action for our own destination, for our own free future. That's what we should do.
Yeah, Phil, is everything going to change tomorrow, or is it going to be more of the same?
Well, I think he's going to announce that the referendum legislation is going to be passed overnight, and he's going to promise the Western Cape a referendum on Cape independence and agree to be bound by the outcome. But I'm probably going to wake up surrounded by fairies. but that's something what I would love to hear tomorrow. But no, of course, we all know it's going to be more of the same. Thousands of excuses, a few promises, and then business as usual, or lack of business as usual.
Anything you want to add before I conclude?
Is that full?
Full, anything you want to add before we conclude?
No. Look, thank you. It was. I enjoyed it as always. It was a real pleasure to meet you, Wynand. I've enjoyed the conversation immensely today, and yeah, it's good to hear other people's views, and it's nice that this political consensus is just more and more, crystallizing around this vision for the Cape. It's exciting for us, and it's exciting for the people who live here.
Yeah, okay. So, Wynand, if you want to add anything, I can.
No, I would just like to thank you, Donald and Phil, for this very nice conversation. Sometimes one debates on this WorldView platform, and sometimes you don't debate. You encourage one another. I'm highly motivated by what Phil has to say and his approach. And I think that is exactly the multi-pronged approach from different parts of the community and different communities working towards the same goal. Some things can only happen outside assemblies, and some things can only happen inside assemblies, and therefore we need each other. And I'm really looking forward to the next year or two.
Yeah. Well, thank you, gentlemen. This has been such an interesting and inspiring conversation. Thank you for your time. To our viewers, if you've made it this far, you must certainly enjoy the content. You know the mantra. Please like, subscribe, and share this video. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.